The dawn mist still hovered over the rows of golden wheat when Caleb Turner first spotted the glint of metal, half buried between the stalks. At first he thought it was debris, maybe some stray scrap from the old irrigation pump, but as he drew closer, he realized it was the wing of a small aircraft. He dropped his shovel and ran, boots sinking into damp earth with each hurried stride. The plane was sleek and white, its tail bent awkwardly where it had clipped the fence. Smoke curled from the engine cowling, but the fire had already died. He circled cautiously, hand over his mouth, and then he saw her. She was slumped against the seat, a trickle of blood trailing from her hairline onto the shoulder of her crisp blue flight suit. He hesitated only a moment, long enough to feel the shock rattle through his ribs, then yanked the door open. "Miss? Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of stormy water. She tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper. "You're safe," he said quickly. "I'm going to help you out of here." She winced as he unbuckled the harness. He noticed how fine her hands were, the smoothness of her cheek even beneath the grime. She smelled of jet fuel and something delicate he couldn't name. Carefully, he lifted her from the cockpit, bracing her weight against his shoulder as he carried her toward the farmhouse. The old place was humble, weathered clapboard, tin roof patched more times than he could count, but it had always been a refuge. As he laid her down on the faded couch, he wondered who she was and what could have brought her over these quiet fields. He fetched a basin of warm water and began cleaning the cut on her forehead. When her eyes opened again, she looked around, dazed. "Where am I?" she murmured. "My farm," Caleb said gently. "You had an accident. I'm Caleb Turner." Her gaze drifted to the window, the plane barely visible through the wheat. A shadow passed across her face, something deeper than pain, but she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're lucky to be alive." He dipped the cloth in the basin again, wringing it out. "What's your name?" She hesitated, as if testing whether he could be trusted. "Ava." He smiled, hoping it might reassure her. "Pleased to meet you, Ava. You should rest." But as he turned to fetch more supplies, she caught his wrist. "Please, don't call the authorities yet." Caleb studied her, sensing that her plea was more than fear of official questions. It was something personal, private. He nodded slowly. "All right, but you need a doctor." "No hospitals," she insisted, her grip tightening. "If you can help me here, just for a day, I'll be all right." He didn't understand, but he heard the desperation in her voice. He'd spent a lifetime reading the unspoken fears of others. The haggard eyes of a neighbor after a bad harvest, the shame of a friend who'd lost everything to gambling. Ava's expression was the same, a fragile dignity clinging to the last threads of pride. "Then you'll stay here," he said softly. "No one will bother you." She exhaled shakily, her hand falling back to her side. For the rest of the morning, he cared for her as best he could, cleaning her wound, offering warm broth, coaxing her to drink water. Between fevered dreams, she told him little pieces of her story. How she'd been flying from Chicago to Denver on urgent business, how the engine had failed without warning. She didn't say what her business was, nor why she'd been alone in that expensive plane. He didn't press her. That night, after she'd fallen into a restless sleep, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, staring at her reflection in the window. He knew he should call someone, maybe the sheriff or the FAA, but something in her eyes had stopped him. He told himself it was simple kindness, nothing more, but when he closed his eyes, he felt the warmth of her hand against his wrist, the silent gratitude that had passed between them. Dawn came again, the fields bathed in pale gold. When he carried in a fresh pot of coffee, Ava was awake, her gaze fixed on the distant sky. She looked stronger today, though her face was pale. "I'll be gone soon," she said quietly. "You don't have to rush," Caleb replied. "You're not well enough to travel." She turned her head, studying him as if trying to memorize every line of his face. "Why are you helping me?" He hesitated, searching for the truth. "Because you needed it," he said finally. "Because you were alone." Something flickered in her eyes, something that looked a little like sorrow. She opened her mouth to reply, but at that moment, a truck rumbled down the road and stopped by the gate. A man in a tailored suit climbed out, scanning the property with a look of practiced authority. Ava's face drained of color. "Who is that?" Caleb asked, alarmed. She closed her eyes briefly. "My assistant," she admitted in a whisper. "He's been looking for me." "Assistant." She swallowed, and in that moment, the mask fell away. "My name is Ava Whitaker," she confessed. "I'm CEO of Whitaker Aviation. The plane, my plane, was carrying documents worth millions. They'll think I was kidnapped. Caleb stared at her, the reality unfurling in his mind. The designer flight suit. The refusal to call the authorities. The quiet desperation in her voice. You're a millionaire. Yes. She looked away, her voice breaking. I didn't want you to know. Not yet. He felt a strange hollowness in his chest. Part of him wanted to laugh. How could he, a farmer scraping by season to season, have imagined she was anyone ordinary? But he saw the shame in her eyes and knew it wasn't about the money. It was about the truth she had hidden and the bond they'd shared in these brief hours of anonymity. Outside, the man approached the door. Ava looked at Caleb, her expression raw with longing and regret. I didn't mean to deceive you, she whispered. I just wanted. The knock came, sharp and insistent. Caleb's heart thudded, and he realized he wasn't ready to let her go. He walked to the door, but didn't open it right away. Instead, he looked back at Ava, who was now standing with difficulty, her hand on the edge of the table for support, her other clutching the soft knit blanket he'd given her the night before. There was something in her face that stopped him, an unspoken plea, subtle but unmistakable. The knock came again, firmer this time. Caleb opened the door slowly, just enough to see the man on the other side. He was tall, pressed into a charcoal suit, holding a leather folder and a phone. His eyes scanned Caleb quickly, dismissively. Good morning, the man said crisply. I'm looking for Ms. Ava Whitaker. There was a crash beacon triggered in this area, and I believe she may be here. Caleb narrowed his eyes slightly. She's resting. Had a rough night. You her assistant. I'm her chief of operations. Ethan Banks. The man's tone shifted, firm and controlling. She's needed urgently. We've mobilized search and rescue, called in favors with the FAA, and paused an international contract negotiation. I'm here to take her back. She's not ready to go, Caleb said, his voice calm but edged with something like warning. Ethan frowned. Excuse me. You heard me. She's still healing. You can wait. Ava stepped into the doorway behind Caleb then, her voice weak but resolute. It's okay, Caleb. Ethan turned immediately. Ms. Whitaker. Thank God. We've been tracking your emergency beacon since yesterday afternoon. You're trending globally. We need to get you back to Denver. There's a press team waiting, and the investors are. I'm not going anywhere yet, she said, interrupting him. He stared at her. Ma'am, with all due respect, this isn't the time to. I said I'm not going. Her voice, though soft, held a command that stopped Ethan mid-sentence. Caleb stood back, letting her come forward. She looked different in the daylight, paler, yes, but more herself somehow. Her bearing was regal, like someone who had once stood before boardrooms and governments alike. Yet now she stood barefoot on his porch, her hair tangled from sleep, her face open and vulnerable. I need time, she said. Just a few more days. The crash took more out of me than I expected. Ethan's jaw tensed. Ms. Whitaker, your father's foundation is calling emergency board meetings. The media's speculating on everything from sabotage to kidnapping. Your silence is costing us millions by the hour. Then let it cost, she said softly. Because for once in my life, I'm choosing to stay somewhere not because of a bottom line, but because I want to. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, then looked at Caleb with renewed scrutiny. Caleb crossed his arms. She's got a room here if she wants it. That all right with you? Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Fine, but I'll be checking in. Daily. He handed Ava a small satellite phone. Press this and I'll be here in 10 minutes. No questions asked. He turned, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked back to the car. The truck engine revved, then disappeared down the dirt road in a plume of dust. Ava leaned against the porch post, the strength leaving her legs again. Caleb steadied her. You didn't have to do that, she murmured. I did, he said. Didn't want you disappearing just yet. She gave a breathy laugh, somewhere between amusement and disbelief. You really are different. From what? From everyone I've ever known. She looked up at him, something unreadable in her eyes. No one's ever spoken to Ethan like that. Not even me. I don't take orders well, he said, smiling faintly. Especially from men who don't know when to shut up. She laughed again, fuller this time, and he felt the sound lodge itself somewhere deep in his ribs. They spent the rest of the morning outside on the porch. Caleb brought her warm tea with honey and a thick woolen shawl to wrap around her shoulders. He pointed to the rows of corn he'd planted in early spring, the irrigation channels he'd dug himself. She listened quietly, asking occasional questions about the soil, the weather, the stubbornness of mules. She didn't speak about her company, or the crash, or the millions of dollars her absence was costing. Instead, they talked about tomatoes. She asked about the odd wooden carving on the porch rail, and he told her it had been his grandfather's, who whittled it during the war. She touched it gently, reverently, as though it were a relic. In the days that followed, Ava's strength returned slowly, but her presence lingered like warmth in the farmhouse's worn corners. She insisted on helping where she could, cutting herbs, washing vegetables, folding laundry with unpracticed hands that betrayed a life lived far from domestic simplicity. Caleb noticed how she smiled more often, how her gaze drifted over the fields with something close to awe. Each night, after dinner, they sat on the back porch as the sun disappeared behind the trees, painting the sky in violets and tangerines. She told him little bits of her life, how she'd been born into wealth, expected to take over her father's company since the age of 15, how she'd never been anywhere without a security detail until now. "You know the irony?" she said one evening, staring at the horizon. "It took a crash to make me feel alive." Caleb didn't reply immediately. He looked at her silhouette, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the chair, the tremble in her voice that had nothing to do with fear. "I don't know much about your world," he said slowly, "but I know what peace feels like, and you haven't had it until now." She turned to him, eyes glistening in the dimming light. "Is this what peace looks like?" "It's not loud," he said. "It doesn't scream, and it doesn't come with cameras. It's quiet. And if you're not careful, you'll miss it." Ava looked down at her lap, then back at him. "I haven't missed it." There was a long pause between them, filled only by the night sounds, the hum of crickets, the soft rustle of trees. Something fragile and tender passed through that silence, and though neither of them said it out loud, it bloomed in the stillness between their chairs like a wildflower no one had planted. On the 7th morning, the wheat shimmered like gold coins under the sun, and Ava stood barefoot at the edge of the porch, her suitcase beside her like an unspoken goodbye. The sky was painfully blue, her jet had been recovered, and the world beyond the Turner farm waited with its claws out. Investors, reporters, shareholders, all thirsty for the return of the woman who once ruled conference rooms with a single glance. But she wasn't the same Ava Whitaker anymore. The farm had changed her. Not because of its simplicity or its distance from the noise of her life, but because of the man who'd opened his door without asking questions, who'd seen her bleeding and afraid and hadn't flinched, who never once treated her like a CEO or a media darling, but like someone who deserved silence, care, and dignity. Caleb stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a worn cloth. He looked the same, boots dusty, shirt rolled to the elbows, but Ava saw him differently now. He was the first man who had ever looked into her eyes without calculating what he could gain. There was no game with him. Only truth. She smiled, but it was faint, tired, heavy with all she couldn't say. "They're sending a car," she said softly. "It'll be here in 20 minutes. He nodded once. "You sure you're ready?" "I don't think I'll ever be ready," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I have to go. Too many people depending on me." Caleb walked to the porch step, his shadow stretching just enough to touch hers. "I never asked you to stay," he said. "I know. But I hoped you might," he added. Ava blinked quickly, turning her face to the sun. "If I stayed, I'd never leave. That scares me more than the world waiting out there." He looked away, jaw tightening. "Then maybe you need to be scared for a while." She stepped closer, so near she could smell the earth on his skin, the scent of wheat and wood smoke that had clung to her every night she'd fallen asleep in that creaky bed inside his home. "I'm going to fix things," she whispered. "But I won't forget what I found here. Or who I found." "I'm not going anywhere," Caleb said. "The wheat still needs harvesting." She reached up and touched his cheek, rough with stubble, warm from the sun. Her thumb lingered there, memorizing the angle of his jaw, the stoic gentleness in his eyes. No goodbye could hold the weight she felt pressing on her chest. Then, the sound of tires on gravel broke the quiet between them. A black sedan pulled into view, its engine purring like a thing from another world. The driver stepped out and opened the door without a word. Ava didn't move. Caleb didn't speak. She stared at the car, then back at the porch where she'd found safety. The door that had welcomed her, the chair where she'd laughed for the first time in years, the windows that framed the rising sun each morning. Then she picked up the suitcase and walked toward the car. Halfway there, she stopped. Her hand tightened on the handle. Her breath hitched, and she turned around. Caleb didn't move. His arms were folded, his eyes unreadable. But she saw something flicker there. Hope. Or maybe a plea. She dropped the suitcase. The driver blinked. "Ma'am." She walked back, slowly at first, then faster, her feet pounding across the dirt path. And when she reached him, she didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him, deeply, desperately, as though she was reclaiming every second she thought she'd lost to the world beyond his fields. He kissed her back with the kind of honesty that only a man like him could give, arms circling her like a promise. When they finally parted, she pressed her forehead to his. "I don't care what the headlines say," she whispered. "I'll tell them I disappeared. I'll tell them I found something more important than mergers and stock portfolios. I'll tell them I found peace." He smiled faintly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "Or you could just say you got lost in a wheat field." She laughed through the tears. "I'd believe it." Behind them, the driver watched in silence, then gently closed the car door and turned away. Ava stepped back, looking around the land, the crooked barn, the line of trees beyond the field, the clothesline still pinned with sun-dried linens. "Let me go fix what I can," she said. "I'll come back." "You better," Caleb said. She turned and walked to the car again, but this time without the suitcase. She opened the door and climbed in, just her, just the woman who had landed in a stranger's field and found everything she didn't know she needed. As the car pulled away, she looked back. Caleb hadn't moved. He stood like a lighthouse, unshaken, a constant in a sea of change. Her hand pressed to the window as the farm disappeared from view. She would go back to her world. She would command boardrooms and rewrite contracts and silence the storm of speculation. But her soul would remain tethered to the rows of wheat and the man who had stitched her back together with nothing but gentleness and soil-stained hands. And when the time was right, when the dust had settled and the noise had faded, she would return, not as a millionaire in hiding, but as a woman in love, ready to choose something real. Because some stories don't end with a goodbye. Some begin when you walk away and know exactly where your heart will come home.